Well, that's somewhat of a collective answer. You can look at it at both the residential level, as someone who actually lives within the jurisdiction of Chatham County and City of Savannah and others, or you can look at as a more comprehensive level from the planner side, which is typically how I try to look at it, and then delve downward even further if you can. As a resident, you need to always be aware of, I guess, to quote, your surroundings, if you will. Where are you living? Where are you purchasing your property and whatnot? And be knowledgeable about your surroundings and your community as a whole. As a planner, as a city official, if you will, we have to look at it at a much more higher level approach to see what's going on within our community, what type of impacts we're going to have over the next 25, 50, even 75 and out years. And fundamentally, you get down into the nitty-gritty of what are your day-to-day operations for those folks that actually work under you, whether it be through public works or your drinking water folks or whomever it might be, engineers, planners, et cetera. And you really have to take all different type of aspects into account through that aspect. But as a resident, I think it's really important, again, to be knowledgeable, but to pay attention and also ask the right questions. Don't be afraid to ask your community and your elected officials those questions that you might be wondering about. You know, another community is doing such and such, and are we doing that in our community, et cetera, and making sure you're actually voicing your opinion to the community, because whether good or bad, the squeaky wheel does make the changes that we often need in our community, and it's okay to ask those questions. I personally think so, at least. Trying to have the conversation with folks instead of looking at just the here and now and even 5 years out, to really get them to think 50, as you mentioned, 50, 75 years out and whatnot. It's tough. It's very tough. It can be a very much of a learning process, if you will. I try as much as possible to bring it down to the level to where they are familiar with it on an everyday level. I often I necessarily don't say climate change or even sea level rise. When we're talking about impacts at the local level, the residents here are very familiar with localized flooding. It is something we have always had to deal with. Born and raised in Savannah and Chatham County, and I've known it ever since, obviously I've been here almost 45 years now. And it's something they're familiar with, and they know that it affects their individual property. So we say, okay, in your time, in your life, you've seen an impact. We're now starting to see roads that have, in the past, have never flooded over for a long period of time. We're now seeing those more and more. In the past, maybe once, maybe twice a year. Now we're seeing them every other month, starting to major highways impassable. And then with the more recent Hurricane Matthew, I think, whether good or bad, I think that really awakened a lot of folks to the reality of what flooding and climate change and what sea level rise impacts can have on the coastal community. The more and more impervious surfaces we're putting down in our community, the water's got nowhere to go. And when you're hitting that at the prime, where there's a high tide, the perfect moon, you're going to find a scenario where we're going to have a lot of water to deal with. And I think that's what folks can relate to. It's that, unfortunately, localized flooding that we've had to deal with for so long. However, over the past number of years, obviously there have been capital improvement projects, SPLOST dollars at both the local level, the state level, coming down to work on those projects. But until we really get a clear, comprehensive approach in place so that we're not just looking at stormwater, we're also looking at our residential development, commercial development, everything as a whole, zoning codes, you name it. All of that's really fundamentally looked at. We're somewhat missing the boat, honestly. However, I will say that we are getting there. We're on the right step, if you will. Chatham County as a whole has started that process. It's not an easy process. It's not a short process by any means. But we are talking about it, and we have a plan in place, and we're moving forward to try and check some of those boxes off. And it's going to be a long process, and it can be quite a contentious process, as you can imagine as well, but we're getting there slowly. With regards to what we've done thus far, so roughly around 10 years ago, maybe right around 12 years ago now actually, Chatham County for the first time did basically an overall comprehensive look at the hazard approach. what were some of the hazards that were affecting our community. And this really hadn't been done on the coastal level with regards to Georgia at all. So Chatham County was really a pilot project for that. And we involved both the state, local, federal government in that process as a whole. So we kind of looked at, what are those hazards? And for the first time, sea level rise and climate change really came to light. And as you can imagine, it really just wasn't being discussed at that point. So, but yet we all agreed that this was something we needed to collectively started looking at. So with that in mind, we moved to the next step and started looking at Chatham County processes. We got some grant dollars in place and are now working with the state and GMA and FEMA as well to start looking at those processes. We have developed a draft recovery and redevelopment plan, which is first one done in the state. Actually, the state as a whole does not have a redevelopment plan model. So basically we're using Chatham County and Savannah's model to pass off to the state for that. And underneath that, there's numerous levels of looking at all the different components: housing, economic, for this particular area, that historic stock that we have in place. That's a huge component that a lot of communities necessarily don't have. So as noted, of course, Chatham County and City of Savannah and all of the communities within Chatham County, over 300 years old, many of them. So we have a lot of wonderful assets here in this community, and it's something that a lot of other communities and cities don't necessarily have to take into account as much as we do. But we want to ensure that our assets, our beautiful resources, not only structural homes and whatnot, but also our tree canopies and those type of natural resources as well, are protected as much as possible and taken into account. So that includes everything from mapping to inventorying to looking at where they are today with regards to stability and that type of thing, and moving forward with a type of, plan for those individual resources, if you will. How are we going to protect them 50 years out? What do we need to do structurally to ensure that they're here for the long haul? So that's really been a big endeavor as well. Just taking into account that, again, Chatham County, a huge part of our economic driver in Chatham County is our historic resources through the tourism. Obviously, we're a huge tourism community, but to ensure that we are basically taking into account the economic stability, we also have to ensure that our natural historic resources and all the wonderful resources that we have around us are also taken care of. So it goes very much hand in hand. So again, ensuring that we're protecting those resources for the long haul. With regards to, where it stands as a priority with our elected officials and leadership, I think climate change, sea level rise, however you want to discuss it as a general item, definitely has become one that is being discussed much more often. I don't know if I would say it's a top priority at this stage. However, I think it's increasingly being talked about more and more, even to the extent where specific dollars are being placed in budget line items, which is a big deal, of course, at the elected level. But looking back at Hurricane Matthew, I think it really did open a lot of eyes, and mostly because we were affected by flooding and debris, of course. But again, it makes you realize as an elected official, I have to make sure that my community is taken care of. There were also different aspects of the community that were affected more so than others. The downtown area, social aspects, as well as the homeless population. We do unfortunately have a larger homeless population within Chatham County, City of Savannah, roughly almost 6,000 people. So that's a large population to ensure that they are getting notified of these type of events and that there's scenarios that they need to ensure that they're being taken care of and safe from, et cetera. So I think a lot of eyes were opened, whether good or bad, through the event. But I really do foresee that it's not gonna go away. The topic is gonna continue to drive, whether it's from the citizens at the grassroots level or from the elected officials. It's been very promising and eye-opening and somewhat invigorating to see the reflection and the outcry to a certain extent from the residents at that grassroots level. I personally think it's been great. You can hear me talk all the time, about it, but to hear your citizens concerned about the same things, and they may not be necessarily vocalizing it and verbalizing it in the same type of way that I am, but they know what the concern is. There's flooding, and are we planning as a community? Are we doing the right thing? And in other words, we want to be ready for the event, not basically reacting to the event. And they're definitely voicing that, and I continue to hold tight to the promise, or to the thought that we're going to see more and more of that for sure. With regards to funding and cost, to ensure you do have an actual resilient community, I think that's still a fresh one. Honestly, we're still in those beginning phases of really looking through our policies and our inventories and what our next steps and what those capital projects need to be. I don't know necessarily that we've really outlaid that to the general public with regards to dollars, because honestly, I'm not sure that we even necessarily know what that final dollar amount's going to be. It's going to be a continuing endeavor. It is a lot. It's going to be a lot of funding. That's going to be required. There's going to be a lot of tax dollars, SPLOST dollars, et cetera, that come into play. So it's not going to be small by any means. However, again, kind of what I continue to try and preach. If you want to continue to see your resources around you, and which you love so much, you moved here for this reason, or you've been born and raised and you want to see them protected, we have to ensure that we are taking care of them right now for the long haul. In other words, whatever that means, that planning aspect, those fundamental dollars that need to go into place, we need to make sure they're there. We can't bury our head in the sand, basically. Very good question. With regards to moving historic assets, that's what we're afraid of. Honestly, I think at this stage, as much as possible, we're trying to assume that everything's going to stay in place and we're going to mitigate on site as much as possible. That's a tough one, because to move some of these 300-year-old properties and the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist and those type of, even smaller type of properties and resources would be very tough. We really haven't gotten to that stage yet. And right now we're really trying to batten down the hatches and tighten, those resources up so that they wouldn't be affected by the inundation of waters and that type of thing. But at this stage, we're hopefully not going to have to remove resources, fingers crossed. Well, I think over the past roughly year and a half or so, as I mentioned, it's been really great to see that kind of grassroots uprising, because as a planner, at the upper levels, we've been trying to mimic it in there and get it in there throughout all these different processes, knowing that it needs to be there, but not necessarily voicing it as much. Whereas again, you're hearing it from the grassroots level even more. I think we've really been trying to almost, as I mentioned, replicate in other areas. We're using social media like crazy as much as we can, and talking to who are those champions in your communities, the ones who are really there, who will back you up. And sometimes they're not necessarily who you would think. Maybe it's an older church member who, when she speaks, everybody listens, that type of thing. And she can remember back in the 1940s when her property used to be much larger and now it's much smaller. It's those type of stories that we're getting out to the community that they can relate to, and they respect those champions, again, of their communities. Again, social media, as much as possible, really trying to get the message out there in the newspaper. You become really good friends with the newspaper and put out articles as much as possible about the topic, but also really try and get it out there in different mechanisms, not just what the problem is, but also what are we doing at the local community to try and assess and address some of those problems. You don't always want to be a naysayer, and there's so much that we're doing at the local level that unless you're really embedded in it, you might not necessarily see the connections. When you're talking about climate change and sea level rise, there is a really a direct effect on our groundwater systems here in the coastal community. And the Chatham County and coastal Georgia area, even portions of Florida and whatnot, we pull our drinking water from the ground, from the Floridan aquifer as a whole. Huge system and highly pristine system. Basically, all we have to do is add chlorine and we're good to go, which is almost unheard of in many parts of the country and the world. So when you start to see, as behind us, the Savannah River, which is directly synced up with where we're pulling our groundwater system, our groundwater drinking, drinking water from the ground, up in Abercorn Creek, you start to, over time, you will possibly see an impact, of climate change, higher waters, higher tides, and that water is going to push further up the Savannah River, basically. And then you can possibly see an impact on your drinking water systems. However, at the local level, we've already started planning for that. We're taking that into account, or adamantly trying to do everything we can to prevent any type of, issues arising. So we have a very strong planning department with regards to drinking water systems. Again, stormwater, drainage, obviously. But when you think about drainage, you might not necessarily always think about the building side of it, your infrastructure, where your roads are placed, where your larger neighborhood communities are placed. And we try to make sure that we're now really looking at, where our wetland areas, even more so than in the past, where will new development and impervious surfaces, when they go down, where will they impact even more and more on our groundwater systems, on our wetland systems, the coastal ecosystem as a whole. So it's really, there's not one answer when you talk about, planning for the future with all of this, for sure. You've got to look at all of your resources. You've got to be comprehensive as a whole. And again, looking at codes and ordinances. It's all great to say, yes, we're planning for it, but unless you really look at your building codes and your zoning codes and what you're allowing where, et cetera, your subdivision codes, everything, you're missing the boat for sure. And that's a huge endeavor, as I mentioned. It goes everything from what type of materials are we putting on the streets, which is your streets department, and your engineering department, to, again, your water systems and where we're pulling our drinking water from. That needs to be taken into account. You name it, it at some point is being addressed. We, as a coastal community, as of April 2012, have fundamentally updated all of our stormwater ordinances and requirements for building code. And we are now looking and requiring more so low impact development and green infrastructure practices, so that at basically getting back to the way Mother Nature does business, if you will, and we're really requiring more and more infiltration into the ground, and so that you're getting recharge into your water systems. But again, when you get that heavy rain, that the water's got somewhere to go. So even by putting permeable pavers and that type of infrastructure into the ground, you're allowing that water to seep down. And it seems like it would be something, minor, but when you look at it collectively over a county or even a small community or a small watershed, it makes a huge impact. Absolutely it does. As well as addressing other non-point source pollutants and those other type of sources that are out there that we also need to take into account, aside from climate change as well. So. Looking at our future, if you will, where it's headed and the priority that is climate change along the coastal area. I have to pause because it makes you wonder, why isn't it already our priority? We're seeing the impacts as it is right now. However, I do want to say I think it is going to become more and more of a priority. Again, if only from the grassroots, hearing that squeaky wheel, getting that up the layers of the elected officials up to the state and federal level as well. I think we're going to continue to broaden our research, to broaden what we're addressing over our time, this short time period. Honestly, I think it's going to take more of what we're doing now. It's going to take more of the outcry to a certain extent. And I probably shouldn't have said the word outcry, because it's not necessarily like screaming and yelling. It's the educated residents, honestly. And it's the educated, students and folks who have lived here all their life asking those questions. What are we doing as a community? Are we doing enough? I do think it will become a priority, maybe not one that they've chosen to be their own priority, if you will, but it will become a priority. Chatham County and Savannah is too important, in all the jurisdictions, I don't want to leave out anybody, too important as a resource to the United States, to the coastal region of Georgia, but also to the eastern seaboard as well. We've got a magnificent powerhouse behind us, actually, through the port, through Gulfstream, through the Army. You know, we've got Fort Stewart, Hunter Army Airfields. We've got just a strong presence, economic drivers here. And that's not going to go away. We're going to continue to see that increase as a whole because we do have so many wonderful things to offer the community. And I think it's also those institutions coming in not afraid to ask that question. Okay, if I'm bringing millions and billions of dollars to this community, I want to ensure that you're going to be here for the long haul as well. We're going to make an investment in you, now you make an investment in us as a whole. So I think we're going to get to that point where as a state, as a community, we really are addressing it, you know, as we should. However, it will take a lot of dollars. It will take a lot of folks standing up, maybe not being, you know, fully recognized and agreed with, you know, with everyone in the room per se, but it's going to take asking those questions, and we need to continue with that. Again, Chatham County as a whole, we are far ahead of a lot of entities. It may feel like we're not some days, but we really, really are. And that's great. You know, so many communities have come to us and called and asked the question, you know, what have you guys done? What are you doing? How do we get started? And that's great to share our lessons, to put the message out there. Do we know everything? No, but we've learned from some mistakes, absolutely, and we're going in the right direction for sure. And I can only hope that, of course, that we get to that instance one day where we're set. You know, we're ready as a community, and we're set for the next 100, 200 years, if you will. It'll take a while to get there, but I do believe that we can do it for sure. That's a great question, and that's been very, very tough to try and differentiate and to keep the believers, you know, in line with you. When you've got, you know, your top levels swaying from left to right necessarily on whether climate change is or isn't real, or what the impact may be, or who's causing it, whatever that question may be, it's extremely tough. However, again, I kind of go back personally to my local experience and my local, you know, stories, if you will, to say, well, aside from what they're saying at, you know, at the national level, are you experiencing this? You know, have you seen this change in your lifetime? Well, then let's focus on that, you know, because that's how you know it's real. I know that, you know, my home where I grew up on now, the lot smaller, you know, we're starting to see failure of so many different type of systems. Tree canopies are starting to, you know, get impacted as well. I mean, there's a laundry list. But I think personally for me, what has really worked and just hit home with folks are those personal stories, in the personal impacts, basically. Because you're not going to get 100%, you know, of agreement, whether it be from the federal level, state level, whatever it might be. It's just, you have to make it real to them, you know, and usually, for what it's worth, the real story to Chatham County is localized flooding, you know. And again, those roads not being able to, you can't drive on them, you know, certain days of the year, or, you know, drinking water well systems went down in Hilton Head because of saltwater intrusion into their systems and whatnot. It's those type of stories. And, you know, again, you just have to make it work for that particular person, that particular community. Know who your audience is, and understand how to relate to them at that independent level, if you will.